Harlem, broad daylight, people on the sidewalk, conversations mid-sentence, a moment that should have passed unnoticed, until it didn't. A man spoke out of turn, not by accident, not quietly. He disrespected Bumpy Johnson in public, in front of people who understood exactly what that meant. The street went still, not silent, alert. In Harlem, disrespect wasn't just personal. It was structural. It challenged more than a man. It tested the invisible order that kept things balanced. Everyone present knew what normally followed moments like this: a sharp response, a fast correction, something definitive, something that closed the situation before it spread. That was the expectation. That was the script. But Bumpy didn't follow it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He didn't leave. He stayed exactly where he was, calm, unhurried, as if the insult hadn't landed, or as if it had landed somewhere much deeper than anyone could see. And in a public space, that pause mattered more than any reaction, because now the crowd was involved. When disrespect happens in private, consequences stay contained. When it happens in public, memory becomes the punishment. Every second without a response forced the people watching to reconsider what they were witnessing. Was this restraint? Was it confidence? Or was it something being calculated in real time? The man who spoke began to realize the danger too late. The attention he wanted was no longer on Bumpy. It was on him, on what he had just triggered, on whether he understood the weight of the moment he had created. Nothing dramatic happened right away, but everyone there knew this wasn't over. And years later, Harlem wouldn't remember the insult itself. They would remember what followed, and how a single public moment quietly reset the rules for everyone watching. Harlem in 1962 wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a public memory machine. What happened on its sidewalks didn't disappear when people went home. It stayed, traveled, and resurfaced in how others behaved days and weeks later. Every exchange carried weight because it was seen, and being seen meant being remembered. That's why the man who disrespected Bumpy Johnson didn't do it quietly. Quiet disrespect dies quickly. Public disrespect lives or kills reputations. He chose the time and place carefully, assuming that the presence of witnesses would protect him. That assumption was common, and often correct. In public, most men softened their reactions. They avoided escalation. They protected appearances. Harlem knew that pattern well. What made this moment different was that Bumpy didn't retreat into politeness or performance. He didn't try to win the crowd. He didn't need to. He understood something the other man didn't. In public spaces, control isn't about reacting faster. It's about deciding whose timing matters. The crowd sensed it instantly. People didn't lean in for drama. They leaned back. They understood that this wasn't going to resolve itself the way street confrontations usually did. No shouting, no crowd-pleasing response. Just a pause that stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Because in Harlem, pauses are loud. Every second without a reaction forced the situation to expand beyond the two men involved. It turned into a shared experience, something that would be discussed later, referenced indirectly, remembered selectively. The insult was no longer the focus. The reaction, or lack of it, had become the event. And that's where power shifts in public. The man who spoke believed the crowd would limit consequences. Instead, the crowd became a multiplier. Witnesses don't just watch. They store. They repeat. They adjust their own behavior based on what they think they saw. And right now, what they saw was a man who didn't rush to defend his status, because he didn't need to. Bumpy stayed where he was, calm, unmoved. Not because he was cornered, but because he was in control of something larger than the moment itself. The sidewalk hadn't turned against him. It had turned into a stage, and he had no intention of delivering the performance the other man was hoping for. That decision changed how the rest of the moment would be remembered, and who would be remembered as having miscalculated it. Disrespect only has power when it's seen. Without witnesses, it's just noise. With witnesses, it becomes a claim, a challenge made not just to a person, but to the rules everyone else quietly follows. That's what the man in 1962 Harlem was counting on when he spoke to Bumpy Johnson the way he did. He wanted the crowd to do the work for him. If Bumpy reacted sharply, the story would be simple. If Bumpy swallowed it, the conclusion would be even simpler. Either way, the witnesses would walk away with something clean to remember. That was the gamble. But Bumpy refused to give the crowd a finished story. By not reacting immediately, he turned the witnesses into participants. Now, they weren't just observing. They were processing. Every person there began asking the same silent question: why hasn't this ended yet? And once people start asking that, they stop focusing on the insult and start focusing on the imbalance it created. The crowd didn't cheer. It didn't murmur. It didn't drift away. It hovered. And hovering crowds are dangerous because they amplify uncertainty. People started studying faces instead of words. Who looked comfortable? Who looked nervous? Who seemed to understand what was happening? And who clearly didn't? The attention shifted. The man who disrespected Bumpy expected to be protected by visibility. Instead, visibility exposed him. In a public setting, being watched is only safe if the audience understands your position. The moment they don't, they begin distancing themselves. Nobody wants to be remembered as standing on the wrong side of a moment that will be retold. Bumpy let that process unfold naturally. He didn't address the crowd because addressing them would have turned them into an audience again. Instead, he let them remain something more powerful, a memory in progress. What people would later recall wasn't what was said. It was how long it hung in the air, how nobody stepped in, how the tension didn't break. It settled. And once it settled, the outcome no longer needed to be dramatic. It only needed to be remembered. That's the difference between confrontation and consequence in public. One ends the moment. The other extends it indefinitely. And by refusing to close the scene, Bumpy ensured that everyone present would leave with the same feeling. Whatever just started, it wasn't finished here. In public, timing speaks louder than action. Anyone can react. Few can afford to wait, and fewer still can make waiting look intentional. That's what separated Bumpy Johnson from the man who tried to provoke him that day in 1962. Bumpy didn't step away, because leaving would have suggested retreat. He didn't step forward, because that would have locked him into a confrontation shaped by someone else. He stayed. Still. Present. And by doing so, he took control of the only thing that mattered now. When the moment would end. Seconds passed, then more. The crowd began to feel the weight of it. Public confrontations are supposed to resolve quickly. A sharp exchange, a visible correction, a clear winner. This one didn't. The longer it stretched, the clearer it became that the normal rules weren't applying. That realization unsettled everyone watching, because it meant they were witnessing something that didn't fit a familiar pattern. And when patterns break, people remember. The man who spoke first began to feel it immediately. His posture changed, his confidence drained in increments. The crowd's attention, which he had hoped would validate him, now isolated him. Silence doesn't stay neutral for long. It starts asking questions. Why hasn't this been answered? Who's actually in control here? Bumpy understood that in public, the absence of reaction becomes a reaction. It forces everyone else to fill in the meaning themselves. Some assumed restraint. Others assumed calculation. But no one assumed weakness, because weakness would have rushed to close the moment. This wasn't hesitation. It was selection. Bumpy was choosing the exact shape this memory would take. Not as a clash, not as a scene, but as a reference point people would bring up later without needing details. Remember that day would be enough. As the crowd slowly dispersed, there was no relief, no sense of closure, just an awareness that something unresolved had been released into the neighborhood. The man who disrespected Bumpy didn't leave triumphant. He left uncertain, and uncertainty, once made public, follows you. By the time the sidewalk returned to normal, the message had already landed. Power didn't need to announce itself. It had demonstrated something more durable, control over the clock. And in Harlem, that kind of control lasted longer than any outburst ever could. The shift didn't come from Bumpy. It came from the people standing around him. At first, no one moved. Then someone took a step back. Another turned slightly away, not in fear, in calculation. Public spaces have their own instincts, and the strongest one is self-preservation. Once it became clear that Bumpy Johnson wasn't going to resolve the moment on demand, the crowd began doing what crowds always do when they sense imbalance. They repositioned. This wasn't loyalty. It wasn't intimidation. It was recognition. People understood that the situation had crossed a threshold. Whatever had been triggered was no longer about the insult itself. It was about alignment, who you stood near, who you spoke to afterward, who you made eye contact with, and who you didn't. These micro-decisions happen instinctively, but they add up fast, and once they start, they don't reverse. The man who spoke out felt it before he fully understood it. Conversations didn't include him anymore, not deliberately, just naturally. No one challenged him, no one defended him either. He had become the focal point of something unresolved, and unresolved moments make people nervous. Standing too close to them feels risky. That's how the crowd chose sides without ever announcing it. Bumpy didn't need approval. He didn't seek validation. He allowed the environment to answer the question for him, and the answer was clear. The crowd wasn't waiting for instructions. It was waiting for distance, from the mistake, from the man who made it, from the possibility of being remembered on the wrong side of a moment that would be talked about later. In public, authority doesn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like being the still point everyone else orbits around. Bumpy became that point simply by refusing to move first. And as people drifted away from the man who disrespected him, the imbalance corrected itself. No confrontation was needed, no ending was announced, but the message was unmistakable. The crowd had seen enough to know who controlled the situation, and who had misjudged it, and once a public space reaches that understanding collectively, the outcome is already locked in. What remained wasn't tension anymore. It was memory forming in real time. Nothing dramatic sealed the moment. There was no final exchange, no visible punishment, no scene that demanded to be retold word for word. And that was precisely why it lasted. In Harlem, stories that survive aren't the loud ones. They're the ones that change how people behave afterward. In the days that followed, the incident moved quietly through the neighborhood. Not as gossip, but as reference. People didn't debate what should have happened. They noted what didn't happen, and more importantly, they adjusted. Public challenges disappeared. Jokes softened. Boundaries that had once been tested casually were suddenly respected without explanation. That's how public power works when it's done correctly. It doesn't rely on fear in the moment. It relies on anticipation afterward. The man who had shown disrespect didn't become infamous because something terrible happened to him. He became memorable because nothing visible did. People remembered the pause, the way the crowd shifted, the feeling that the situation had ended without ever being closed. In Harlem, that kind of unresolved moment carries more weight than any confrontation. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to reinforce the lesson. He never referenced it. He didn't have to. The crowd had already internalized the outcome. Public space had been recalibrated. Everyone understood that not every challenge would be met on the challenger's terms, and that some reactions were delayed, selective, and shaped far beyond the original moment. That understanding stayed. Months later, when people spoke carefully in public, they weren't thinking about the insult itself. They were thinking about the day they saw a situation refuse to resolve the way it was supposed to. They remembered how uncertainty had spread faster than outrage, how restraint had carried more authority than response. That's why the crowd never forgot, not because they witnessed power flexed, but because they witnessed power withheld. They saw what happens when someone controls not the outcome, but the memory of the outcome. And once a neighborhood learns that lesson, it doesn't need reminders. It carries it forward, quietly, collectively, and for a very long time. What happened in Harlem in 1962 didn't endure because it was shocking. It endured because it was incomplete. There was no clear ending, no visible punishment, no moment people could point to and say, that's when it was over. And that absence stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Bumpy Johnson didn't assert control by dominating the scene. He did it by refusing to let the scene dominate him. In a public space, surrounded by witnesses, he demonstrated something far rarer than aggression: the ability to let a moment breathe until everyone else adjusted around it. That's the kind of power crowds remember, not because it demands attention, but because it rearranges behavior afterward. People didn't walk away talking about what Bumpy did. They talked about what they felt: the pause, the shift, the way the atmosphere corrected itself without instructions. And once that feeling took hold, it changed how people acted in public long after the moment itself had passed. Years later, no one needed to describe the incident in detail. The lesson was already embedded in how people spoke, where they stood, and what they chose not to say out loud. Harlem didn't remember the insult. It remembered the restraint, and what restraint signaled about who truly controlled the tempo of the street. Power that relies on spectacle fades quickly. Power that survives witnesses becomes memory. And that's why, long after the sidewalk cleared and the crowd dispersed, the moment remained. Not as a story of confrontation, but as a quiet reminder of how authority can exist without ever needing to announce itself.